Dan,
People really have some gall questioning the accuracy of the administration of elections and the counting of votes. There's just no place for that in America. That undermines our democracy.
tell
Because,
it to Jake Tapper. Didn't you read a book about it
yeah,
when it was on the other side?
this is, these are sour grapes people, they're conspiracy theorists. There's no problem with the administration of elections in America, particularly in Democrat controlled states, particularly in Democrat dominated big cities.
I suggest they watch the Great McGinty about Chicago votes.
Or they could just listen to Democrats in New York, like, what was her name? Maya Wiley. Her advisor, Patrick Gaspard. Someone please tell the New York City Board of Elections that the 1900s just called and would like to get their manual tally sheets back. City Councilman Ben Callos from Manhattan, Democrat. Now is as good a time as any to blow up the Board of Elections, get rid of the patronage, and start over. So, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the Board of Elections in New York City has botched the count on the city's first ranked choice election, adding 135,000 pre-election test ballots that hadn't been cleared from the computer.
So you count them again and again until you get what you want. See, said Johnny Rocco in Key Largo.
Exactly. That's a nice Johnny Rocco reference.
That's right.
And so, any type of auditing of an election, any type of checking the count, that is illegitimate. I mean, if you're doing it in furtherance of the 2020 election or as a check to the 2020 election or as a sort of a best practices review of how you administer elections prospectively for the 2022 and beyond elections. All of that in Maricopa County, in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, illegitimate because we don't have any problems with elections in this country. Just look at New York City. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Ken Blackwell, board member of the Public Interest Legal Foundation and former Ohio Secretary of State, so he knows something about the administration of elections. Ken, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Good morning, Dan. Good morning, John. Good to be with you.
How about that cluster frack in New York City? New York City's not showing very well, is it?
No, it isn't. But the left, the Democrats, Pelosi, Schumer, they are running a frontal attack on our constitutional republic and our election integrity in this country. Look, it is very clear that they are hell-bent on making sure that they federalize elections, that they create a model that is taken out of the pages of the books of other status throughout human history. And Aristotle, as we've talked about before, summed it up right when he said that, there's a direct relationship between the organized power of the state and the flourishing of individual liberty. The more muscular the central government or the state, the less human liberty. And so our founders put a harness on the growth and reach of the federal government, decentralized power, invested power now in the 50 states, not in the central government. And that is the way that we protect against a form of government that is now filling the pages or the ash bin of history, and that is forms of government that believe that great nations are the products of great government, not of good people doing great things and free people doing great things together. So this frontal attack must be dealt with if we're to have confidence in the results of our elections.
A smart bartender I know in Chicago told me years ago, before I started writing a column, that that political control begins and ends in the city of Chicago with the Chicago Board of Elections. And I find that to be true after, 30, 40 years doing this. The question being, what is so wrong about federalizing the elections nationally so that we're all on the same page, say the Democrats? We're all doing the same thing. You tell me what's wrong with it. I have my own theories, but
Well, look, again, what we know is that in elections, if you want to build confidence, there are a couple of tracks that you have to make sure are secure. First is the chain of custody. That means that you want less vulnerability of something going wrong between the time the voter casts his or her ballot and when it's counted. And so we want to have a tight chain of custody. The second thing is that you want a verification process or practice that helps you to understand and guarantee that a person is who he or she claims to be. When you have good verification systems, a tight chain of command, you in fact have elections that people can have confidence in. If you put the power in Washington, D.C., take it out of the hands of local folks, what you get is a chain of custody that is very vulnerable, very loose. And if you look at what the Democrats are calling for, and that is to do away with verification processes and practices like voter ID. And so you create a context where people are doubting the authenticity and the legitimacy of election results. And that's a recipe for chaos.
What did you make of Bill Barr's interview by Jonathan Karl that appeared in the Atlantic? Of course, this was picked up by the D.C. press corps as a cudgel to, whack any Trump supporter who wants to see what comes of the Maricopa County audit or wants to see other election reforms advance in the states in question from 2020 in advance of 2022 so they can have more confidence, what you're speaking about. Your reaction to what Bill Barr had to say about the back and forths he had with the president over the election?
Well, look, at the end of the day, I don't want the central government, the federal government, and federal bureaucrats running elections. And so I'm part of a movement outside of Washington that basically wants to secure the rights of state legislatures to determine the time, place, and manner of elections. That is what is at risk. And if in fact you're supporting the attack on state legislatures doing that, I think you're Looney Tunes. If in fact you're supporting that, I think you understand that in 245 years, this country has become the most robust, the most free constitutional republic in all of human history. And that is because we got something right. I'll go back to it. When you put a harness on the reach and power of government, you in fact, you create a context where individual liberty flourishes. Anybody who talks about centralized control of elections or who badmouths people who are pushing for decentralization and local control, state control of elections, we're in a fight.
And that was evidenced again this week with the decision by the Department of Justice to file suit against the state of Georgia per its election reform law. It really curious case.
Just look at that. Look, let's just talk about it. I think we've talked about it before. Let's just take voter ID, which is a part of the Georgia reforms. If you take a look at that, look at the fact that the Justice Department is attacking that as racist, and it's a throwback to Jim Crowism. It is crazy because they then moved the All-Star game from Atlanta to Denver, Colorado. If you look at Colorado's election laws, practices, and rules, they are more restrictive than the Georgia reform laws. And so it's a major contradiction. It's hypocrisy, and it's just flat out wrong. And we must resist this sort of stupidity.
And just on,
speaking of which, I'm sorry.
well, just one more, because I want to get the John Lewis voting rights law too, because this is relevant. It's relevant to that suit that was filed by DOJ. And when you keep talking about federalization of the election, I just want people to understand this and some of the nomenclature that's used to indicate the truth of what you're saying. The John Lewis bill would resurrect pre-clearance rules nationwide. In other words, at the state level, you would have to get federal clearance before you could change your election laws, and that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, yes. Look, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is a landmark piece of federal legislation in the United States that prohibits racial discrimination in voting. It was signed into law by Lyndon Johnson, and it is one of the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in U.S. history. It targeted the election practices of 9 southern states and some northern jurisdictions, and it said that they had to operate under pre-clearance. There could not be any changes of any of their laws without pre-clearance. Well, that is no longer in place, but the left, Pelosi, Schumer, what they want to do is to do this new so-called John Lewis Act, which is nothing more than a Pelosi power grab. What they want to do now is place all 50 states under pre-clearance, which means that there could not be any change in any election law or practice or rule or policy.
Right.
Unless it was pre-cleared by bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.
Because things are worse in America today than they were in 1965, right?
Yeah, right out of the 1619 projects, New York Times 1619 projects playbook. They claim that America is irreparably racist, must be flattened, must be radically changed, and our form of government must be fundamentally transformed into something right out of Marx and Lenin and Mao. State control.
2 is good, 4 is better, said George Orwell. And listen, I need to ask you about Stacey Abrams of Georgia, because she was the darling of the shriekers.
Shadow governor.
Yeah, she's governor, right? She's governor of Georgia, or just in her own mind? But
she hasn't conceded yet.
But I recall her shouting at the top of her lungs to all her friendly listening audience, MSNBC, the Washington Press Corps, that voter ID was Jim Crow. And lately I've been hearing her say that no one has ever objected to having to prove to vote. Now, I'm wondering, now most Americans think that voter ID is a pretty common sense thing. So I vote, and therefore the great McGinty doesn't vote in my stead, right? I'm sure you've seen that movie.
Well, look, guys, let me just tell you, right? I went right at Stacey on this. She was advocating, along with her woke friends at Coca-Cola and Delta, that they moved the All-Star game to Denver, and as out of Atlanta. This was a game that was an all-around voter ID and other common sense practices. This was a game that was going to generate $110 million, for the businesses and entrepreneurs of Atlanta, a city that is over 50% black. They moved it to Denver, Colorado, and which is 9% black, and Colorado has more restrictive voting rules and regulations than the reforms in Georgia. It is just crazy. If you two guys were coming down to Cincinnati, I would just frame this. I'm probably the only shareholder of a Major League Baseball team that has ever administered a statewide election. If you guys were coming to Cincinnati to see the Cubbies play the Reds,
Never would because I don't watch the Cubs. But anyway, yeah, I get it.
Or the White Sox, and if I sent you tickets, or told you that there would be 2 tickets for you at the will call window, in order to pick up those tickets, what would you guys have to show?
Present ID, perhaps.
My good faith.
They got a library book to get on an airplane, to go to Coca-Cola's headquarters in Atlanta.
To buy cigarettes.
God, that's right. It is so commonplace that it is just foolhardy to suggest that black folks or any other folks would object to it.
But why do the issue to me is twofold. One, the media seems to carry the water of those crying racism on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
And two, the media, because they don't really care about what's going on the ground, don't seem to understand that black people are somewhat skeptical of the new immigrants coming in, and they're really not all that upset about voter ID.
No, we're not upset about voter ID. And guys, I'll probably have to close out in 2 minutes, but let me just tell you this. This is a frontal attack on the progress that we made under Donald Trump. Donald Trump really did. He cut regulations, he cut taxes, he created an environment for cheap energy, he rebalanced trade, he increased defense spending, he had arms transfer for our allies, which created jobs and built a stronger alliance for freedom across the globe. And he lifted family incomes, dropped unemployment, and somehow that sort of freedom, that sort of prosperity needs to be undone by the left. The left wants to undo it. That's what this is all about, to put them in control of the nation's agenda. This is crazy. We must resist, 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 resist.
Ken Blackwell, board member of the Public Interest Legal Foundation, former Ohio Secretary of State. Ken, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate your time.